Well, good morning once again. Welcome to Southwest Church of Christ. My name is Bryan. I'm the pulpit minister here, and it's great to have you all joining us. This summer, our message series is a living sacrifice, and it's based off of the book of James. But I just can't help but point out this little rubber ducky here that's on the podium just for a second. This has nothing to do with my sermon, but I just realized that my kids went to the Popsicle Palooza earlier in the week and had a great time at the splash pad, got this, came to hang out with me at church, and then left this here in the pulpit for me. So that's kind of fun. And it's not a sermon illustration at all. I just needed to point that out so we can all acknowledge it and then move on. So like I said, the theme for this summer is a living sacrifice. It's based off of the book of James. And I chose a theme verse for our study on James, and it comes from the book of Romans, which I realize is not even in the same book. But this passage from Romans chapter 12, verses 1 through 2, does a great job of talking about this idea of because God has been good to us, now we as disciples of Jesus go out and try to do good in the world, try to honor him. The motto here is glorify God, love others, and make disciples. And we do that because of the grace and mercy that God has given us. So our theme verse, Romans 12, 1 through 2 says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." So we are called to be a living sacrifice, but the key phrase in all of that is in view of God's mercy. Everything that we've talked about in James, which is a highly practical book of the Bible that teaches us how to live with wisdom, how to live in a way that honors God on a daily basis, all of it is a response to the grace and mercy that God has given us. And that phrase, in view of, can mean because of, but it can also mean through, like through the power of God's grace, we offer our bodies as a living sacrifice. So the grace of God is not only our motivation for going out to follow Christ, it is also the power through which we are actually able to do it. Because if we're being honest, God sets a really high bar for the kind of people he wants us to be and the kinds of lives he wants us to live. It's because of God's grace that we try to do it, and it's through the power of his grace that we are able to actually succeed. Now today, as we've been talking about already, the theme of the day is waiting patiently. That's the title of the message. We're going to be in James chapter 5. We've entered into the last chapter of the book of James. We're going to be covering chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. And the key principle here that we're going to hear in James 5, 1 through 12 is that mature Christians wait patiently for God's will to be done. Even in the midst of sorrow, even in the midst of tragedy or injustice, mature Christians wait patiently for God's will to be done because they know that God is full of compassion and mercy. Now, in this specific situation that James is going to be talking about and addressing, the problem is that there were certain wealthy members of society, certain wealthy members of the community that were abusing their positions of power to exploit the poor. The rich were getting richer in ways that caused the poorest members of their society to suffer greatly. And many of those poor people that James is talking about are members of the church, people who love God and are following Jesus and have done everything they can to honor God, and still they are experiencing terrible injustice and suffering in their lives. James is writing to those Christians who are wondering, God, where are you? How much longer am I going to have to put up with this? He's writing to those Christians to encourage them to stay faithful and to wait patiently for God to make things right. James starts by pointing out all of the terrible things that these rich people are doing. In James 5, 1 through 6, he starts talking about everything that they're doing wrong. He says, "Now listen, you rich people. Weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourself in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. James just kind of goes like point by point to point out everything that these rich people have done wrong. They are hoarding wealth instead of taking God's blessings and paying them forward to others. They're not just sort of living a nice middle-class kind of life, but they are overindulging in luxuries, going way over the top. Not just the sort of nice things that they might want or need, but overindulging in luxuries. And in order to go from like rich to obscenely wealthy, they are withholding money from people who are working for them, withholding their wages. And in doing so, they are actually causing some of their workers to suffer and die. Because at that point in history, that point in this kind of society, those day laborers would come in and they would do the work, and they would get paid that day so that they could go to the market and buy money for their families for that day's food. They lived literally paycheck to paycheck, day to day. So if they were to miss a paycheck, their family wouldn't get to eat that day. These rich members of society were withholding pay, causing the people that work for them to suffer and starve to death. These rich people weren't using the blessings that they had received in a very kind or generous way. Now, I think it's important for us to point out that when the Bible talks about wealth and money, it never says that being rich is bad. It just says that most of us struggle to be good and rich at the same time. It is hard to be good and rich because we have a very self-centered perspective on our possessions. I like the way that Rick actually put it. He did a sermon series on generosity and giving at the Hills Church in Fort Worth. He said, being rich isn't bad, but most of us are bad at being rich. Because once we get a little bit of money, we don't necessarily use it to bless others. We use it to bless ourselves. And Jesus even sort of warns against how dangerous it can be for a believer to become wealthy because it becomes a distraction. And it becomes something we put our hope in, our trust in, instead of a resource we use to glorify God, to love others, and to make disciples. So why are we so bad at being rich? I think we can turn to the candy aisle and find at least one answer to it. Do you guys remember or have heard of the candy called Now and Later? I think one of the reasons we struggle at being good and rich is because we have a now and later attitude about our lives. And what I mean is, a lot of times our attitude is, I want my rights now. I want the things that I'm entitled to now, and I'll worry about my responsibilities later. If there's something that I feel I want that now, but I'm going to procrastinate on fulfilling my obligations to you or to society. So give me what I want now. I'll worry about doing good things for other people later. It's kind of part of our instant gratification culture. Everything needs to be faster. We want all of the benefits without any of the sacrifice or the hard work that leads to those benefits. And we are sort of so indoctrinated by this, so accustomed to this, we are conditioned to expect convenience. We start to feel entitled to get our way and to get it right now. And so the result is that if we hear these terribly offensive words like no or not yet, we end up feeling really anxious and restless and angry whenever dares to say those things to us. I think Satan is hard at work in that sort of whole concept there. He's trying to convince us that having more, and having it right now, that's so vital to our happiness that it really doesn't matter what sort of moral or legal or scriptural lines we have to cross to get it. The only thing that really matters is getting the things that we think we need. And I think that kind of mindset explains the behavior of the rich people that James is talking about. They knew that what they were doing was wrong. But they bought into the idea that they needed more, and they needed it now in order to be happy. So to them, they stopped caring about how their actions affected others. The only thing that mattered was getting what they wanted, and it didn't matter who they had to trample on along the way. Like I said, these things that they were doing, they knew it was wrong. You can go back to the Old Testament and find this exact scenario described in detail of God saying, hey, don't do this. Deuteronomy 24, 14 through 15. Just listen for how relevant this is to what James is talking about. The Old Testament says, do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing in one of your towns. Pay them their wages each day before sunset, because they're poor and are counting on it. Otherwise, they may cry out to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin. This is the exact situation that James is addressing. Poor Christians being exploited by the rich. They don't have enough money for that day's food because their wealthy boss is trying to pad their bottom line, trying to add a fraction of a percentage point to that month's profit. And in doing so, they are exploiting the poor and depriving them of the food that they need to feed their families. And for the rich people, it didn't really bother them, because in their mind, the ends justify the means. God, on the other hand, calls their actions a sin and says that judgment is coming. So James starts with this really harsh critique of what the rich people are doing, and he's reminding them that judgment is coming. So from here, there's a turn in the passage. I want to help explain kind of the connection between what James is saying here and what comes next, because from here, James makes a transition to the importance of Christians waiting patiently for God to make things right and to bring guilty people to justice. He begins by condemning the practices of the rich, the selfish practices of the rich, and then he transitions to, it's important for us to wait on God. And I think something that'll help us understand that connection or that transition is just taking a quick look back at some of the other things that James has said about wealth and money and possessions in his letter. If we kind of understand what he said so far, I think it paints a picture that helps understand what comes next. So just for a second, if we go back to James chapter 1, verses 9 through 11, one of the things that James points out is that wealth and pride tend to go hand in hand, just in the same way that poverty and humility seem to be two sides of the same coin. And the way that we know that is because he actually portrays humility and wealth as opposites. You might expect humility and pride, but in this instance, James chapter 1, verse 9, believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position. But the rich, on the other hand, should take pride in their humiliation. So poor people tend to be humble, rich people tend to be prideful. And chapter 4 was all about the danger of pride and the path that takes us on. So James is sort of lumping in the rich and the wealthy with the prideful people that are on that path of destruction. It helps us understand why he's so critical of them. And he also helps us understand that he tends to see the church as not so much the rich people who are exploiting others, but as the persecuted group in society who are being exploited by the rich who are out there. And we see that also in James chapter 2, verses 6 through 7. He's talking to the church and saying, you've dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich who are exploiting you? Are they not the ones dragging you into court? Are they not the ones who are blaspheming the noble name of him to whom you belong? He's reminding the church it's the rich people out there who are exploiting you. The rich people out there are dragging you into court. The rich people in society are blaspheming the name of the God we follow, of Jesus, our Savior. And so when you kind of add that up, what seems to be clear is that James is written primarily to poor Christians in humble circumstances who are sometimes being exploited by wealthy members of their community. They are the ones who are having to go without food because evil, unjust people are depriving them of the money that they are owed for doing their work. So they are in that position of being oppressed and exploited, and they're probably wondering, God, what are you doing here? We are the Christians. We are the ones who have sacrificed for you. We're the ones who are trying to do the right thing, and yet we're still experiencing this terrible persecution, this terrible injustice in the world. The question that they're probably wondering is, why would God allow this? Why would God allow good people to suffer at the hands of these evil people who are breaking his laws? And when is God going to show up to actually do something about it? And anyone who's been in a similar kind of spot of feeling like they've done everything right for God and still they're facing that illness. Still they're facing that tragedy. Still they're the ones who are being unfairly treated. Anyone who's been in that spot wrestles with the same kinds of questions. God, where are you? How much longer am I going to have to endure this injustice? When are you finally going to show up to right these wrongs and do something and fight for the people who are fighting for you? The Old Testament is full of stories of people who wrestled with those same kinds of questions, full of stories of good people suffering at the hands of evil men and women who were trying to oppress them and oppose them. And the book of Psalms in particular is full of their prayers as they openly wondered where God was in the midst of all of their suffering. James 5 is really talking about the question of, God, where are you when life goes wrong? And why would God allow all these unjust things to happen? And what should our response be when we are in a similar kind of spot? If you go to the book of Psalms, you'll find all kinds of prayers that sound like this one from Psalm 13. It's a psalm of lament. And it begins like this: How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord, my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. This is a song of lament, of wondering, God, how much longer am I going to have to endure all of this? I think we can all relate to that on some level, of wondering why the good people in the world have to put up with so much suffering. And it might not be, in your instance, the rich exploiting the poor. It could be any number of tragedies or circumstances that are far too much for the average person to be able to handle on their own. I think we can all relate to this on some level. Mark Vregup wrote a great book on the Psalms of Lament. It's called Dark Clouds and Deep Mercy. He experienced loss in his life, and he found a lot of grace and healing by working through the Psalms of Lament. And he defines lament in this way: lament is the honest cry of a hurting heart wrestling with the paradox of pain and the promise of God's goodness. It's understanding on the one hand that God is good and God has made good promises for us, that he is compassionate and gracious and slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. It's knowing that God is a good Father, but at the same time knowing that pain and suffering are real. And it's that the lament is standing in the gap between who you know God to be and what you know life to be like in the real world, and just wondering, how do we bring these two things together? We can turn to the Psalms of Lament and hear the painful, honest cries of hurting hearts throughout the history of God's people, wrestling with this question of where God is in the midst of this kind of sorrow. James, in the next several verses, is going to write to Christians who are wondering that same thing. In their specific situation, it was oppression at the hands of the rich. but it's applicable to any kind of painful, difficult situation that we find ourselves in, situations that bring us to wonder, how long, Lord? So James 5, 7 through 9 now, he writes these words for every Christian who has wrestled with these thoughts. He says, "Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy." To every Christian who's wondering, God, where are you? How much longer? James begins by saying, be patient. As a father, I know that sometimes when I say the words, just be patient to my kids, sometimes it's more a reflection of me being annoyed at their attitude in that moment, annoyed at their impatience. All I'm really saying is, I can't handle the way you're acting anymore, so just be patient and get over it. Sort of dismissive of their hurts, a little dismissive of their feelings. I don't get the feeling from James that he's just annoyed at Christians and saying, just get over it, just be patient. I'm tired of hearing you guys complain about it. These are not the words of an exasperated elder or church leader just saying get over it. I think what James is doing here is actually giving us a reason to put our hope in God and a reason why our patience is going to pay off. He talks about the harvest that's going to come. He uses that analogy to say, if you go out and plant some seeds on a Monday, you're not going to have a full harvest on a Tuesday. It takes a little bit of time, and it takes some patience, and it takes the rain. It takes a little bit more than just planting, and then all of a sudden you have the full thing ready to go. He uses that as an example to say, we need to be patient. And he brings up the example of Job, a very compelling story of a man who suffered greatly, lost a lot, but ultimately never lost his faith in God. So when he says be patient, he's not being dismissive. I think what he's doing is saying, here's the reason why you can be patient. It's because of the compassionate nature of God. God is full of compassion and mercy. If we know who God is, that can allow us to have a different perspective, to reorient our perspective away from the problems that we're experiencing and focus more on the goodness of God that we're following. And that kind of reorientation is a frequent feature of the Psalms of Lament. David or one of the other psalmists will start out with these really tough, hard, painful questions about why God would allow all of this suffering and injustice. But later on in the psalm, there's very frequently this turn away from the problems and towards God's goodness. In Psalm 13, which I read from earlier, the turn happens in verse 5. So after how long, God, where are you? How long are my enemies going to triumph over me? In verse 5, David says, but I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. The turn in that psalm of lament, his turn from despair to hope, is based on three things that the world can never take away. He's able to change his perspective because he focuses on three things that those evil people who are oppressing him can never take away. He focuses on God's unfailing love, on the hope of salvation that he has, and on all of the good things that God has done in his life leading up to that. And when David talks about the unfailing love, it's that Hebrew word chesed, which we talked about from Exodus 34, that God is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love, that loyal covenant love. In James chapter 5, the turn from being oppressed by these rich people, not having enough food to eat, the turn away from that is based off of the compassionate and merciful nature of God. Two things that no one can ever take away from us. So the bigger principle here is that our knowledge of who God is, like when we know that God is a good, good Father, our knowledge of who God is and how he's been faithful to us and to others in the past should have a direct impact on our attitudes and actions in the present. So another way of saying that is when we open up the Bible and see all the amazing things that God has done for God's people in the past, we're not just reading about what happened in the past. It's telling us what God is doing and will do for all of God's people today, in the present, and into the future. These stories we read, it's not just history, it's also a promise of who God is today and what he's up to in our lives, which is why it's so important for us to know God's heart and to know his character and to root our hope not in the circumstances in the world, which change so frequently, but to root our hope in the unchanging goodness and nature of God. These Christians were in a tough spot. Life was not going well for them. Even though they were doing everything right, it still seemed like they were losing. And they had to be wondering, God, where are you? James says, be patient, stand firm. Not because your circumstances are just magically going to work out, but because God is full of compassion and mercy, and he will not abandon you. And no matter what the world takes away from you, it can never take away God's love and the hope of our salvation and God's goodness. James chapter 5, verse 12 is sort of disconnected from that whole discussion about patience, and it's sort of disconnected from what happens next. It's more like a wrap-up of everything James has been saying in the book about using the right words, watching our speech, taming our tongue. I'll read that for you. Just keep in mind that I think this kind of stands apart a little bit and is really trying to wrap up that theme. But James chapter 5, verse 12 says, above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no, otherwise you will be condemned. What he's talking about here is having the personal integrity to follow through on the things that you say without having to add anything artificial to it. And especially if you sort of have a reputation of maybe not following through or being a little bit truth challenged in some of the things that you like to say, he's saying, be really careful about invoking the name of God to make up for your own lack of credibility. You shouldn't have to do that. We should have the integrity to follow through, to say what we mean, to mean what we say, without having to sort of swear or take an oath or something like that. Again, I think that's just a little bit more connected to the talk in the book about taming our tongue and watching our speech. But to wrap up just the idea here from the first 11 verses in particular about waiting patiently, I think what James is calling us to do is to trust in God's timing, to know that he has a plan, he has our back. We don't need to rush into action to try and solve those problems, but we need to trust in God's timing. We need to remember God's goodness, that even if the world takes a lot away from us, it can never take away the goodness of God. And I think that something we should mention is that maybe you are kind of in a position of power. Maybe you are one of those rich people that he's talking about. I think the advice for all of us is make sure that we're not part of the problem for someone else. I would love to have people praying for me, but I really don't want people to be crying out against me in prayer. I don't want to be part of the problem. I don't want people praying about me because I'm causing them problems or I'm oppressing them. And I know no one in the room does either. We need to make sure that we're not part of that problem by taking advantage of others. Something that you can do this week, I put it in small print at the bottom of this slide here, would be to dwell in Psalm 37 this week. Because it's a psalm that talks about how important it is for us to wait and to trust in God, and to not worry so much when we see evil people seeming to succeed in our world. I'll just read a couple verses of that. I invite you to read the whole thing this week if you can find some time. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes. Refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret, it only leads to evil. For those who are evil will be destroyed, but those who hope in the Lord will inherit the land. I'm thankful that Jesus had that kind of attitude when he was put on trial and led to the cross. I'm grateful that he patiently endured the pain of the cross so that we can receive the gift of salvation. I'm grateful that he didn't abandon his calling when life got tough, but he chose to have the perseverance to push through. And every single person in this room has benefited from that kind of patient endurance in the face of unjust suffering. So right now it's going to be our invitation song, and it's a chance for all of us to dedicate our lives to God, recommit to following Jesus, or to just talk and pray with one of the elders of this church about something that's going on in your life right now. So let's go ahead and stand and sing this next song. And if you'd like to talk or pray, our elders will be available in the back of the room.